Grief is among the most human of emotions. It reminds us that something or someone once mattered enough to leave an absence behind. But what happens when those who believe themselves beyond humanity are confronted by a loss they cannot escape? What happens when an entire legion of the Angels of Death convinces itself that grief is not to blame, but the flesh that allows them to feel it? The Iron Hands are remembered as cold, uncompromising warriors, obsessed with replacing their own biology with steel and machinery. Across the Imperium, they are known for a single creed, that the flesh is weak. But this is not their full story, because there was a time when the sons of Ferrus Manus were not consumed by cold logic or merciless efficiency, and there was a time when the Primarch himself warned against the very obsessions that would later come to engulf them. Long before they came to despise their own flesh, the Iron Hands were counted among the Imperium's greatest conquerors, their strength forged through iron conviction. That is, until upon a world of black sand, that conviction was murdered. In the 10,000 years since, they have searched for strength through denial, replacing flesh with iron, compassion with calculation, grief with hatred. Yet for all their devotion to logic and machine perfection, the Iron Hands remain defined not by reason, but by a wound that they have never allowed themselves to mourn. This is not a simple story of half-machine warriors who believe the flesh is weak. This is the story of a legion that never recovered from the day its Primarch died, and of grieving sons who, in trying to honor their father, slowly became everything he never wanted them to be. Long before they became synonymous with steel and machinery, the Iron Hands were simply the 10th Legion, created during the closing years of the Unification Wars on Terra. In contrast to some of their fellow first founding legions, the early history of the 10th remains unusually well preserved. Their recruits were drawn from across Old Earth, with a great many coming from the harsh warrior cultures of Old Albia. The Legion's first campaign saw them deployed against enemies both human and Xenos throughout the Sol system, whether clearing out vicious mutant strongholds hidden within ancient orbital structures, or hunting alien enclaves beneath the frozen surface of distant worlds. They displayed remarkable coordination under even the harshest of battlefield conditions. Time and again, they achieved their objectives with surprisingly few losses, demonstrating a level of warfare discipline that set them apart from many of their contemporaries. Their earliest defining moment, however, came during the Great Crusade upon a desolate mining world remembered by Imperial historians simply as Rust. The planet had been transformed into a vast slave colony by the Orc Empire of Warlord Kulu, beneath smoke-choked skies amidst deserts of iron oxide and the rusting carcasses of ancient cities. Millions of green-skinned brutes ruled over an immense human population, harvested in interstellar raids and forced to labor in the world's mineral-rich deposits. Conditions were unspeakable. The only mercy for its captured human inhabitants, a woefully short life expectancy. When the world was discovered, it was immediately marked as a priority target during the opening years of the Great Crusade. Shortly after, the Emperor launched what was, at the time, the largest coordinated offensive yet undertaken by his fledgling Imperium. 11 Space Marine legions, supported by hundreds of Imperial Army battle groups, struck dozens of Orc-held worlds across the Crooked Claw Empire in a vast campaign remembered as the Seraphina Offensive. The liberation of Rust was entrusted to the 10th Legion, backed by formations of the Imperial Army and the battle automata of the Mechanicum. Overall command rested with the Legion's Lord Commander Duquesne. Drawing upon the pitiless military traditions of Old Albia, Duquesne devised a strategy known as the Hammer and the Storm. After securing a landing from orbit, he ordered the Imperial Army to deploy in strength upon the open wasteland between the three largest Orc fortress settlements. There, they entrenched themselves and waited. It was a calculated provocation. The Imperial Army would be the Storm, drawing the Greenskin horde out from its fortified cities and into open battle. The plan worked exactly as intended. Within hours, millions of orcs surged across the plains. The terrain dissolved into carnage as the Imperial defenders fought desperately to hold the lines beneath an endless tide of attackers. Requests for reinforcement or permission to withdraw were refused. Duquesne instead waited until virtually the entire orc host had committed itself to the assault, gathering in such numbers that some accounts claim the horde could be witnessed from orbit. Only then did the hammer fall. Gunships and assault landers punched through storms of anti-aircraft fire, carving a path for the 10th Legion's armoured spearhead. Heavy tanks tore directly into the heart of the orc advance, with disciplined ranks of legionaries and towering dreadnoughts advancing in perfect formation. The Legion moved as a single engine of war, an immense harvesting machine methodically grinding through the enemy with relentless volleys of fire, before reforming and advancing again. Fast-moving skimmers and jet pikes swept around the flanks, hunting down isolated survivors. For days, the orcs continued to hurl themselves against the advancing Legion. The 10th met every assault with the same measured precision, repeatedly reforming their lines before launching fresh counterattacks, leaving the wasteland behind them smothered by mangled war machines and the dead. Rust was liberated. Nearly 1 billion enslaved humans were freed. Remarkably, the 10th Legion lost fewer than 1/5 of its warriors in the fighting. The tactic of the Hammer and the Storm would go on to be employed repeatedly throughout the Seraphina offensive. Several other legions would later study and attempt to emulate it. Those who fought beside the Legion bestowed upon them a new name, the Stormwalkers. However, it would not remain their name for long, as soon word began to spread among the Imperium that the Legion's lost Primarch had been found. Like all of the Primarchs, Ferrus Manus would never get to grow up alongside his father. Before his Great Crusade had begun, the Emperor's sons were stolen, cast through the warp by the ruinous powers. These infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, eventually coming to rest upon distant worlds. One of these worlds was Medusa. Ferrus's arrival upon the planet was not subtle. His gestation capsule descended from the heavens like a falling star, burning through the dense clouds that smothered the world before striking the tip of Karashi, the great ice pinnacle of Medusa's northern wastes. The impact exploded the mountain. A cataclysmic stream of ice and fire erupted across the frozen landscape. The ground trembled across the entire planet. Mountains collapsed, and great chasms opened in the earth. For generations afterwards, the clans of Medusa would pass down stories of that day, claiming that the mountains themselves had broken apart in fear of the giant sleeping beneath the ice. Medusa was a brutal and unforgiving planet of perpetual gloom. Its skies were permanently darkened by volcanic ash, while immense mountain ranges and towering volcanoes dominated a landscape constantly reshaped by earthquakes and intense geological upheaval. At the poles, vast frozen wastelands stretched for miles, while under the ice hid the forgotten remnants of ancient civilizations and machines left behind from ages long before the Imperium. Humanity had not prospered there. The survivors of Medusa had dissolved into scattered techno-barbarian clans, their ancestors having once belonged to a far greater civilization during the age of technology. Now, struggling to survive upon a world that seemed determined to destroy them, they traveled aboard enormous land crawlers and fought one another constantly for access to the planet's limited resources. Life on Medusa was a continual test. The elements were an enemy, other clans were an enemy. It was a world where weakness was fatal, and it was into this wretched environment that the infant Primarch emerged. He wandered across the great northern wastes for a time, before eventually making contact with the Medusan clans. Swiftly fully grown, Ferrus possessed strength and endurance beyond anything the clans had ever encountered. Yet, curiously, he was not content simply to possess such gifts. Instead, he sought challenge. Ferrus ventured across the length and breadth of Medusa, exploring regions that ordinary humans could never hope to survive. He scaled its highest mountains, crossed its deepest oceans, and ventured into dark places that the clans considered forbidden realms filled with ancient horrors. Every obstacle was an opportunity to test himself. The legends of Ferrus Manus grew quickly among the clans. As with many ancient tales, the truth became intertwined with mythology, but the core of every story remains the same. Ferrus Manus was a warrior who refused to accept his own limits. One of the greatest legends surrounding him was his confrontation with Caanok, the great silver worm. According to ancient Medusan legend, Ferrus pursued the creature through the lands of shadows, a mysterious region filled with enormous ruins and relics from a forgotten age. There, he encountered a being whose skin was said to be living metal, a substance stronger than any armor. Ferrus attacked the creature with all his strength, but his blows could not penetrate its living metallic hide. Realizing brute force alone would not suffice, Ferrus changed his approach. He dragged the creature to a nearby river of molten lava, plunging the squirming beast inside with both fists, enduring unimaginable pain from the heat as it killed his foe. When the battle was over and Ferrus withdrew his arms from the flames, he discovered that the same strange metal that had protected the creature had fused itself to his own flesh. Though unconfirmed, Imperial scholars have speculated that the worm may have been some form of ancient Necron construct, constructed from the same living metal known as necrodermis. Regardless, the Primarch's hands and forearms had been forever changed. The living metal was unlike anything known to mankind. It possessed the flexibility of living tissue, but seemingly impenetrable durability. His eyes had also changed, becoming silver and losing their pupils entirely. That said, Ferrus was not just a mighty warrior, he was also a craftsman, an inventor, and a teacher. Returning to the clans, he shared knowledge that transformed their survival into something greater. With his strange metal hands and extraordinary understanding of craftsmanship, he taught them to shape weapons and tools unlike anything the Medusans had previously crafted. He also led warriors into the frozen depths beneath the planet's surface, exploring ancient ruins and recovering lost machines from forgotten eras. There they fought against mutants, decayed cybernetic creatures, and ancient engines of war that had survived from humanity's darkest ages. Ferrus did not seek to bring peace to Medusa or end the conflicts between rival clans. Instead, he believed that hardship forged strength, competition fostered improvement, and survival demanded excellence. The clans accepted him as one of their own, and eventually Ferrus became their greatest warlord, uniting them through respect rather than worship. Humanity's rediscovery of the planet came during the earliest expansions of the Great Crusade, where Imperial explorers encountered the barren and broken world, surrounded by the remains of ancient orbital structures and long-abandoned technology. Hidden among the ruins, they found something infinitely more valuable than any lost machine or material resource, however. They found a Primarch. The arrival of the Imperium upon Medusa was unlike anything the clans had witnessed before. For the second time in their history, the skies split apart. Clans gazed in confusion and fear as huge vessels descended from the stars. Ferrus Manus, however, appeared to understand. Without hesitation, he traveled to the place where the strange craft had landed. For weeks, there was no word from him. Then Medusa began to answer. The skies erupted with intense electrical storms, while the entire planet convulsed from mighty earthquakes. For 8 days, the world raged around whatever confrontation was taking place in the mountains, until the storms finally faded and an unnatural silence descended across the planet. 1 day later, Ferrus Manus returned, but he did not return alone, for he had found his father. Walking beside him was a being of impossible presence and power. The Emperor was reunited with his son, who had already forged himself into exactly the kind of leader the Imperium desperately needed. Like Horus Lupercal and Leman Russ before him, Ferrus was among the earliest Primarchs to be rediscovered. He was already a ruler, a conqueror, and a legend among his adopted world, and as such, his transition from planetary warlord to commander in the Great Crusade came naturally. Ferrus left with the Emperor for Terra, but before departing, he made a promise to the clans. Medusa would always remain his home. When Ferrus Manus assumed command of the 10th Legion, he inherited an already formidable military force, but he also inherited raw potential. The disciplined Stormwalkers possessed many of the qualities he admired, but Ferrus felt these virtues could be sharpened further. With the precision of a master craftsman, he analysed every aspect of the Legion and reshaped it in his own image. Under their Primarch, the Iron Hands were elevated from an effective army into a perfectly oiled machine of war. Ferrus understood that within his Legion burned immense pride and a barely restrained fury. Rather than attempting to extinguish these passions, he showed them how to master them. Their anger remained, but it was bound by iron discipline, rather than unleashed recklessly. They were the Emperor's hammer, relentless, calculating, and utterly without mercy. Every engagement would be analysed, refined, and executed with ruthless efficiency. Their already methodical style of warfare became even more systematic, every company operating as part of a greater mechanism in which every warrior, vehicle, and weapon had a clearly defined purpose. Emotion had no place on the battlefield. Logic dictated every decision. Keeping his promise, the union between Ferrus's Legion and their new homeworld of Medusa became absolute. The traditions of Medusan clans became the foundation of the Legion's new identity, and their organizational structure was gradually replaced with clan-based formations. As the Legion expanded beyond Medusa, Ferrus ensured that the world's traditions followed them. From conquered human populations, the strongest youths were taken and brought back to Medusa, where they would face the same harsh existence as the clans themselves. Those who survived would eventually earn the right to join the ranks of the Astartes. As the Legion evolved, another characteristic became increasingly apparent. Unlike many of their brother legions, the Iron Hands placed immense value upon craftsmanship. Ferrus himself was not only one of the greatest warriors of the Primarchs, but also one of the finest craftsmen humanity had ever produced, and his sons sought to emulate him in both pursuits. Shortly after his arrival upon Terra, he crossed paths with Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children, under the great forges of Mount Naradina. Both believed themselves the greater craftsmen, and what began as a prideful challenge soon became a contest that lasted for months, each striving to forge the finest weapon ever created. When their work was finally complete, neither Primarch declared himself the victor. Instead, each looked upon the other's creation and judged it superior to his own. Ferrus presented Fulgrim with the blazing sword Fireblade, while Fulgrim gifted Ferrus the mighty Warhammer Forgebreaker. In that moment, the two Primarchs demonstrated something rare among their kind. Rivalry born not of jealousy or resentment, but of competition that elevated them both. Following their Primarch's example, artificers, engineers, and armorers flourished within the Legion. Weapons and armor were endlessly refined, while vehicles were modified and maintained to exacting standards. If a stronger weapon could be built, they would build it. If an enemy possessed superior technology, they would study it, they would understand it, and they would devise a counter. Their growing expertise naturally strengthened bonds between the Legion and the Mechanicum. Having inherited much of Medusa's ancient technological traditions, Ferrus and his sons found a uniquely deep kinship with the priesthood of Mars. Both saw technology as the key to overcoming limitation, and both viewed mastery of machinery as essential to humanity's future. Through the ancient bonds established between Medusa and the forge worlds of Mars, the Iron Hands gained access to knowledge, equipment, and expertise that few other legions could match. This relationship became formalized through the Legion's Mechanicum-trained officers and techno-mystics, warriors who stood apart from ordinary Legion commanders by combining the duties of a Space Marine officer and a Mechanicum priest. They served as a bridge between two cultures, preserving the traditions of both the Astartes and the Martian priesthood, while ensuring the Legion maintained its unparalleled understanding of technology and warfare. Through them, the Iron Hands acquired experimental weapons such as grav guns and conversion beamers, refined their already formidable warfare, and became among the Imperium's greatest artisans of war. Yet despite their similarities with Mars, Ferrus Manus never viewed technology as something to be worshipped. To him, machines were tools, extensions of human capability, created to overcome weakness and achieve victory. The Iron Hands did not seek technology because it was sacred, but because it logically worked. Every recovered relic or new invention served a single purpose: to create a more efficient instrument of war. Throughout the Great Crusade, they frequently fought alongside Mechanicum cohorts and mighty Titan legions, often refusing military aid from other parts of the Imperium, instead requesting reinforcements in the form of Mechanicus automatons. These wars suited the Iron Hands perfectly. While other legions excelled in siegecraft, infiltration, or lightning-fast assaults, Ferrus deliberately forged his sons into specialists of grinding, high-intensity warfare. They thrived amidst the deafening chaos of armored offensive, colossal war machines clashing head-on, the enemy met with a blizzard of overwhelming firepower. No matter their foe, the Iron Hands repeatedly proved themselves amongst the Imperium's most dependable warriors, and before long, the Emperor began deploying them accordingly. The Iron Hands became the core of the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet, carrying the Primarch's doctrine of relentless advance across the galaxy. Again and again, the Iron Tenth, as they came to be known, were dispatched wherever the Great Crusade encountered its most heavily defended battlefields, or worlds where vast enemies threatened to halt the Imperium's advance. They also fought alongside many of their fellow legions during the Great Crusade, frequently serving as shock troops of vast Imperial offenses, with Ferrus Manus himself repeatedly assuming overall command of combined expeditionary fleets. Some of these hard-fought campaigns forged deep bonds of mutual respect that would endure for decades, none stronger than the friendship between Ferrus and Fulgrim. Others, however, bred rivalries and resentments that never truly faded. Every success further solidified their reputation, and every campaign reinforced their military techniques. But the Primarch demanded far more than battlefield excellence from his sons. Failure, in his eyes, was unacceptable. Failure represented weakness, and weakness above all else was intolerable. On Medusa, weakness had meant death. In the Great Crusade, weakness endangered not only individuals, but all of humanity. Those who faltered, be they aspirant or veteran, were expected to overcome their shortcomings or be removed. Weakness within an ally was viewed with impatience. Weakness within an enemy deserved only destruction. Weakness within themselves was considered the gravest failing of all. To his sons, Ferrus was the Gorgon. This name, however, originated not from fear, but from friendship. It was his brother Fulgrim who first gave Ferrus the name that would follow him throughout his life. Fulgrim had joked that his brother was a terrible Gorgon, because he was so focused on the acts of war that he failed to appreciate the beauty and wonder that humanity was fighting to reclaim. But the name endured because it captured something fundamental. To his sons, Ferrus Manus became the Gorgon made flesh, a figure seemingly drawn from ancient myth, a being of impossible strength and towering intellect, whose silver gaze seemed capable of turning enemies to stone. He was quick to anger, slow to forgive, and lavish with neither praise nor affection. His judgment was uncompromising, his expectations seemingly impossible to satisfy. Yet he applied those same standards first and foremost upon himself. He demanded no sacrifice from his legion that he would not willingly make, and no excellence he did not already embody. To his sons, a single word of approval from their Primarch carried greater value than any medal, honor, or celebration ever could. They loved him not because he was gentle, he certainly was not, but because they believed utterly in the strength of the example he set. To many Imperial commanders, the Iron Tenth were among the Emperor's most dependable legions, capable of breaking almost any enemy through sheer discipline and overwhelming force. To many who fought beside them, however, they appeared cold, belligerent, impatient, and disturbingly indifferent. They conquered worlds with extraordinary efficiency, but seldom lingered to rebuild them. Diplomacy, politics, and the winning of hearts were concerns they gladly left for others. The task, as Ferrus saw it, was far simpler: to make war, to destroy the enemies of mankind, and then to move on to the next battlefield. After more than a century under their Primarch's command, the victories of the Iron Hands had become too numerous to count. Many were never recorded in detail at all. Through Ferrus Manus, the 10th Legion had become something new. They were the sons of Medusa and disciples of everything the world had taught their Gene Father: endurance, strength, and the belief that weakness must be overcome. Horus Lupercal, then Warmaster of the Emperor's Great Crusade, understood the worth of Ferrus Manus better than almost anyone. The Gorgon commanded one of the Imperium's most formidable legions, and his strategic brilliance, unwavering resolve, and mastery of warfare could be invaluable to the coming rebellion. Rather than face the Iron Hands as enemies, Horus sought to make them allies before the rebellion begun. And so, he entrusted the task to the one Primarch who might actually succeed: Fulgrim. Confident that the bond they had forged over decades of brotherhood would endure, Fulgrim sought Ferrus out aboard his flagship, the Fist of Iron. There he preached of Horus's grand vision, of a new Imperium where the Primarchs could shape humanity's future as they saw fit, and urged his brother to commit his legion, believing together that they could reshape humanity's future. However, to Ferrus Manus, the very suggestion of treason was unfathomable, abhorrent, and unforgivable. The meeting ended in violence as the two Primarchs clashed within Ferrus's private forge. Though neither brother died that day, their friendship did. Fulgrim escaped, taking with him Ferrus's Warhammer Forgebreaker, while leaving behind the blazing sword Fireblade in its place. Meanwhile, word of Horus's betrayal had already reached Terra, and the Emperor's call to arms was dispatched. Consumed by white-hot fury, Ferrus answered the Emperor's summons without hesitation. Alongside the Salamanders and the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands descended upon Istvan V, believing they would crush Horus's rebellion before it could spread. Instead, they deployed into one of the greatest betrayals in Imperial history. Their opening assault struck with tremendous force. Ferrus himself led the attack directly into the heart of the traitor lines, while Vulcan and Corvus Corax advanced upon either flank. The Loyalists drove deep into Horus's defenses, convinced the victory lay within their grasp. With the traitors beginning to falter, a second wave descended upon Istvan. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Wordbearers arrived claiming to be reinforcements, but their allegiance had already been secretly sworn to Horus. They had not come to save the Loyalists, they had come to slaughter them. As their guns opened fire, the drop site massacre begun. Decimation was all-encompassing, resulting in the death of hundreds of thousands of Loyalist Astartes. Of the 3 Loyalist forces ensnared within the trap, it was the Iron Hands who suffered the heaviest losses. But even then, Ferrus refused to withdraw. Blinded by grief and rage over Fulgrim's betrayal, he ignored the console of his brother Primarchs and pursued the retreating Emperor's children, determined to confront Fulgrim himself. In doing so, the Primarch, famed for his cold logic, committed the greatest mistake of his life. Emotion had overridden reason, and his legion followed him into the trap. Amidst the slaughter of the Ugal Depression, the two brothers finally met once more. They fought one another with the same weapons they had exchanged all those years before. Ferrus wielded Fireblade, Fulgrim carried Forgebreaker. The duel was long and brutal, with both Primarchs grievously wounding the other, though only one would survive the encounter. The two demigods fought as near equals, but Fulgrim was no longer fighting by his own strength alone. With the corrupt power of chaos flowing through him, the balance finally began to tip against Ferrus. For a fleeting moment, as Fulgrim prepared the final blow, he faltered. Horrified by what he had become, he tried to stop himself, but by then it was already too late. The demonic blade he had claimed upon Laren no longer obeyed its wielder. Against Fulgrim's own will, his sword swept through Ferrus's neck, and the Gorgon fell. With their Primarch dead, only scattered survivors escaped Istvan V, and the Iron Hands would not fight again as a unified force for the remainder of the Horus Heresy. The Iron Hands came to believe that Ferrus Manus had failed because he had allowed emotion to triumph over logic. His anger had clouded his judgment. To the Iron Tenth, that failure revealed a bitter truth. Flesh was weak, emotion was weakness. Weakness had killed their father. In the centuries that followed, the Iron Hands devoted themselves to eradicating both. They embraced ever greater cybernetic augmentation, suppressed compassion beneath cold calculation, and pursued the ideal of perfect logic with renewed fanaticism. This is where the greatest tragedy of the Iron Hands can be found. Their Primarch had spent his life teaching his sons to overcome weakness, but he had never believed that humanity itself was a weakness. He valued discipline and self-improvement because he believed they allowed mankind to reach its full potential. Tragically, in the aftermath of the Dropsite massacre, the Iron Hands came to interpret their father's final moments rather differently. They saw his grief, his anger, and his attachment to a fallen brother as the very things that had doomed him, and so rather than confronting the pain of losing their Primarch, they buried it beneath logic and denial. In the eyes of the remainder of the Iron Tenth, flesh, emotion, and humanity itself had become weaknesses to be purged. The surviving Iron Hands returned to Medusa as a legion forever changed. The Tenth had lost its Primarch, its brothers, and the certainty that had guided it since the days of the Great Crusade. With Ferrus Manus gone, the Iron Hands faced a question no legion had ever expected to have to answer. How could they continue without their father? Their answer came through the creation of the Iron Council. Said council would become the new ruling authority of the Iron Hands. No single warrior would ever again hold the position of absolute command that Ferrus Manus had once occupied. Instead, the chapter's future would be determined through collective calculation, debate, and logic. The reforms that followed became known as the Tempering. Their allegiance with the Adeptus Mechanicus also deepened during this period. After losing their Primarch, they turned increasingly towards the machine cult for knowledge, technology, and a philosophy that aligned more closely with their own belief in the superiority of the machine. When the second founding began in the aftermath of the Heresy, those surviving Space Marine legions were divided into smaller chapters in accordance with the new Codex Astartes. The Iron Hands were no exception. Remnants of the 10th Legion were reorganized into the Iron Hands chapter, while other successor chapters were created from their surviving gene seed. Unlike several of their brother legions, the Iron Hands offered no political resistance. They did not accept Guilliman's reforms because they agreed with his philosophy, but because logic dictated there was no alternative. Compliance simply represented the most rational course available. As the Iron Hands continued to fight in the Emperor's name, the centuries that followed saw them drift further from the ideals their Primarch had once championed. His sons instead increasingly pursued perfection through replacement, augmentation, and the removal of perceived weakness. Machines became the ultimate ideal for the individual to aspire towards. For 10,000 years, the Iron Hands have remained among the Imperium's most relentless defenders. They have fought countless wars against Xenos traitors and heretics, earning a reputation for uncompromising efficiency and devastating military precision. But they have also carried the burden of their own legacy. Every battle fought, every augmentation taken, and every sacrifice made has been shaped by the memory of the Primarch they lost on Istvan V. Although outwardly compliant with the Codex Astartes, the Iron Hands have increasingly interpreted its doctrines through the lens of their own traditions. Over the millennia, their organization has evolved into something unlike almost any other chapter in the Imperium, and its foundations are the chapter's 10 clan companies. Unlike most Codex-compliant chapters, whose companies maintain distinct battlefield specializations, the Iron Hands organize their entire chapter around these 10 clans. Led by Iron Captains, each maintains its own command hierarchy, armories and recruitment traditions, often waging wars independently for years at a time before rejoining the wider chapter. This organizational independence draws influence from the state of their homeworld. Medusa's violent tectonic instability makes the construction of a permanent fortress monastery impossible. Instead, each clan company maintains their own immense mobile stronghold known as a land behemoth. These colossal tracked fortresses endlessly traverse the planet's shifting continents, serving simultaneously as a monastery, forge, armory, and recruitment center. From these wandering citadels, clans seek out worthy aspirants from Medusa's nomadic tribes to become the next generation of Iron Hands. Even the chapter's squads, known amongst the Iron Hands as claves, reinforce the clan-based identity that permeates every level of their organization. Overseeing each clan company are its Iron Fathers, a role pivotal to the chapter's culture and internal structure. Unique amongst the Adeptus Astartes, an Iron Father fulfills the duties of a chaplain, tech marine, and clan elder simultaneously. He is not responsible only for the spiritual discipline of his battle brothers, but also for guiding their continual cybernetic augmentation throughout their lives. To the Iron Hands of the 41st millennium, mastery of the soul and mastery of the machine are inseparable pursuits. The Iron Fathers stand at the intersection of both. Above each clan stands the Iron Council. Instead of a sole chapter master, the Iron Hands are governed collectively by 41 Iron Fathers who gather within the eye of Medusa. From amongst their numbers, a single war leader is elected to command the chapter for one standard year, though the same individual may be chosen time and again if the council deems it logical to do so. Debate, calculation, and collective judgment take precedence over individual authority, reflecting the Iron Hands' belief that no single commander should ever again hold the fate of the entire chapter in his hands. In the era Indomitus, the chapter still maintains one of the closest alliances in the Imperium with the Adeptus Mechanicus. Since the days of the Tempering, the Iron Council has included the Voice of Mars, an unofficial delegation of senior Mechanicus adepts. In return for their military support, the Iron Hands have long been granted access to deep technological knowledge and augmentation techniques few other chapters possess. On paper, the Iron Hands remain a Codex-compliant chapter. In reality, they have become something altogether different. A brotherhood of fiercely independent clans, guided by ancient councils, bound to the machine, and organized according to doctrines found nowhere else in the Imperium. Although the organization of the Iron Hands has been shaped by logic, efficiency, and collective command, these principles are only the outward expression of a much deeper belief that defines every aspect of their existence. The flesh is weak. To the Iron Hands, weakness is not limited to physical frailty. It encompasses anything that prevents mankind from achieving its ultimate potential. Flesh decays, flesh suffers, flesh is vulnerable to disease, age, pain, and failure. The machine, however, represents endurance, precision, and certainty. This is the foundation of the Iron Hands culture. From the moment a warrior is accepted into the chapter, he begins a lifelong process of transformation. Upon becoming a full battle brother, every Iron Hand undergoes the ritual replacement of his left hand with a cybernetic equivalent, an act inspired by the ancient legends surrounding Ferrus Manus and the living metal that once encased his hands. Some choose to sever their own hand as a declaration of commitment, while others endure its removal via the volcanic fires of Medusa, allowing the flames to consume their flesh. Whatever the method, the meaning remains the same. The weakness of the body must be overcome, and this first augmentation is just the beginning. Throughout centuries of service, Iron Hands battle brothers continually replace their organic components with increasingly sophisticated cybernetic systems. Limbs, organs, and sensory functions are gradually exchanged for mechanical equivalents, each replacement viewed as an improvement over the limitations of biology. While many other Space Marines view their gene-enhanced bodies as the pinnacle of the Emperor's design, the Iron Hands see even the Astartes form as imperfect. Their bodies may surpass those of ordinary humans, but they remain vulnerable because they remain flesh. This pursuit of mechanical perfection is reflected throughout their traditions. Among the most distinctive is the Forge Chain, a series of augmetic vertebrae implanted into an Iron Hand's spine throughout his life. Each new link represents acceptance into a new clan company or a further stage of service within the chapter, with every clan company crafting its own unique components from different materials and designs. The Forge Chain is a symbol of both individuality and unity. Each warrior carries the mark of his clan, but ultimately every link forms part of the same unbroken chain. The most honored warriors of the chapter may receive further blessings of iron, undergoing more agonizing ritualistic augmentation as recognition for their service and dedication. To the Iron Hands, becoming more machine than flesh is not a loss, it is an achievement. It is the final expression of their belief that mankind's future lies in transcending its limitations. Yet beneath their controlled exterior lies a chapter engulfed by intense emotion. The Iron Hands are not without anger. Rather, they bury it under layers of calculation, allowing their hatred to emerge not as uncontrolled fury, but as cold and methodical destruction. The greatest influence upon their culture, however, remains the loss of their Primarch. The Gorgon was the first of the Emperor's sons to fall during the Heresy, slain by his brother's hand, yet the final fate of his corpse remains unknown. The devastation of Istvan V consumed everything around him, and his body was never recovered by his sons. Without a corpse to mourn and surrounded by the lies and confusion of the battlefield, some within the Legion refused to accept the Gorgon was truly gone. The absence of certainty only deepened their grief, but instead of processing it, they dedicated themselves to eliminating it. Their father never believed that flesh itself was the enemy, and he never sought to erase humanity from his sons. His pursuit of perfection was not about abandoning what they were, but about mastering themselves and becoming better than they had been before. The Iron Hands inherited their father's desire for strength, but the trauma of his death fundamentally altered the meaning behind it. They saw his final moments not as the consequence of betrayal, but as proof that emotion and flesh had failed him. 10,000 years later, the Iron Hands remain among the most powerful and technologically advanced warriors in the Imperium. Their dedication, discipline, and mastery of war are undeniable. But below the iron, beneath the augmetics, and under the cold certainty of logic, remains the legacy of a Primarch whose greatest lesson was never truly understood. Ferrus Manus sought to forge his sons into something stronger. The tragedy of the Iron Hands is that, in their pursuit of that strength, they slowly begun to forget what they were meant to preserve. Despite their formidable reputation, the Iron Hands possess one of the most unusual afflictions of any Space Marine chapter. Unlike the Blood Angels, whose genetic curse manifests through the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, or the Space Wolves, whose Canis Helix threatens to overwhelm their humanity, the flaw carried by the sons of Ferrus Manus is far more subtle. Its true origins remain uncertain. Some within the Adeptus Mechanicus have suggested that the flaw may originate from a defect within the Iron Hand's gene seed. Others argue that it is not a biological flaw at all, but a psychological wound inflicted upon the chapter by the loss of their Primarch, and reinforced over thousands of years by their own uncompromising beliefs. Whatever the case, the result is unmistakable. As an Iron Hand grows older, his hatred of weakness becomes increasingly directed towards himself. The chapter's creed that the flesh is weak becomes something deeply personal. He begins to look upon his own body not as the Emperor's greatest creation, but as inherent imperfection. Every scar, every limitation, and every reminder of mortality becomes something else to despise. This perception holds little weight in reality, and Adeptus Astartes already represents the pinnacle of human evolution, a super soldier whose body has been painstakingly engineered through genecraft and surgical augmentation into something vastly superior. Even the tech priests of Mars replace their flesh in pursuit of improvement because they begin as ordinary men and women. To outside observers, the obsession can appear pathological. When an Iron Hand looks upon himself, he no longer sees extraordinary strength. He sees only weakness waiting to fail. The response is almost always the same. Damaged limbs are replaced with augmetics rather than being allowed to heal. Healthy organs are exchanged for mechanical equivalents. Cybernetic enhancement gradually gives way to outright replacement, until many veterans of the chapter have willingly surrendered much of their original flesh, despite having no real medical need to do so. Every piece of steel implanted is seen as another weakness overcome. Every remaining fragment of flesh, something to distrust. Some among the chapter recognize this compulsion for what it is, though many do not, and in time, the obsession claims them all. Furthermore, this curse does not remain confined to the afflicted individual. As the Iron Hand's contempt for their own perceived weakness deepens, it begins to shape the way they judge everyone around them. Loyal allies who advocate restraint or seek to preserve lives are viewed with disdain, their arguments dismissed as poor reasoning of those too weak to do what is necessary. Sadly, in their relentless pursuit to eradicate every trace of weakness, the Iron Hands have become blind to the possibility that their all-encompassing fear of weakness is itself the greatest flaw they possess. The combination of their catastrophic losses during the Horus Heresy and concerns surrounding their gene seed contributed to the Iron Hands producing few successor chapters compared with other first founding legions. Despite these concerns, neither Mars nor the Inquisition has ever judged the flaw severe enough to warrant intervention. Whatever burdens the sons of the Gorgon may carry, their loyalty has never been in question, and few chapters have proven more devastating in the defense of the Imperium. The culture of the Iron Hands is built upon the rejection of weakness, and their approach to warfare is the physical manifestation of that belief. Every campaign begins not with zeal or righteous fury, but with calculation. Before committing a single warrior to battle, the Iron Council conducts an exhaustive strategic assessment known as the Calculum Rationale, analyzing every variable, from enemy strength and available war material to atmospheric conditions and orbital support options. Only once victory is deemed mathematically achievable are the necessary forces committed. No more and no less. To the Iron Hands, war is won through the precise application of overwhelming force. Unlike many chapters who charge into combat amidst thunderous battle cries and prayers to the Emperor, the Sons of Medusa march in near total silence. Their Vox networks remain reserved for essential battlefield communication, while the only sounds accompanying their advance are the heavy footfalls of ceramite boots, the steady hum of power armor, and the disciplined roar of bolter fire. They move with relentless purpose, maintaining a measured pace regardless of the enemy before them. Defensive lines are dismantled with methodical precision, and any weakness is identified and exploited without hesitation. To witness an Iron Hand's advance is to witness a machine carrying out its function, utterly indifferent to fear, casualties, or exhaustion. However, when circumstances demand it, their restraint can vanish in an instant. The measured advance becomes an explosive assault, as centuries of repressed hatred are unleashed with astonishing speed. Warriors surge forward with unlikely acceleration, smashing through barricades, rending apart armor with chainswords and power fists, and reducing fortified positions to mangled wreckage with overwhelming firepower. Even then, they fight in silence, their actions speaking far louder than any battle cry ever could. The Iron Hands regard entombment within a dreadnought sarcophagus as one of the greatest honors a battle brother can achieve. There, suspended between life and death, the chapter's greatest heroes continue to wage the Emperor's wars long after their mortal bodies have failed. It is not uncommon for these revered ancients, once Iron Captains or Iron Fathers, to be awakened from their endless slumber whenever the chapter marches to war, their towering forms once again leading the assault into the heart of the enemy. Although the Iron Hands lost huge numbers of Terminator suits during the drop site massacre, those few that remain have become some of the chapter's most sacred relics. Rather than deploying entire Terminator squads as many chapters would, The Iron Hands often disperse these priceless veterans amongst their battle line, allowing warriors clad in Terminator armor to lead conventional squads into battle, their presence serving as both a tactical asset and a symbol of the chapter's enduring strength. By contrast, the Iron Hands field an extraordinary concentration of armored vehicles. Every clan company maintains vast armories of battle tanks, dreadnoughts, and other ancient war machines, crewed by battle brothers who interface directly with their vehicles through sophisticated bionic implants. The Iron Hands do not seek glorious last stands or impossible victories against overwhelming odds. They seek decisive success, achieved through preparation, discipline, and exploitation of every weakness their enemies expose. Few chapters prosecute war with such precision, and fewer still leave so little to chance. No warrior has led the Iron Hands for longer since the death of Ferrus Manus than Iron Father Kardan Stronos. Although the chapter rejects the office of a permanent chapter master, one Iron Father is always elected by the Iron Council to act as its war leader for a limited time. In theory, this position passes between many different commanders as circumstances demand. In practice, however, Stronos has remained the Council's chosen leader for more than 3 centuries. Repeatedly re-elected by his fellow Iron Fathers, he has become the closest figure the modern Iron Hands possess to a true chapter master, but his importance extends far beyond the longevity of his leadership. Unlike many of his predecessors, Stronos has gradually sought to temper the chapter's most uncompromising doctrines. While never abandoning the creed that the flesh is weak, he has argued that logic without humanity is not perfection, but another form of weakness entirely. Under his leadership, the Iron Hands have begun the slow process of rediscovering ideals that had been buried beneath 10,000 years of repressed grief and mandated dogma. It is perhaps the closest the chapter has come in millennia to honoring not only Ferrus Manus' strength, but the original intent with which he led his sons. While Stronos guides the chapter, Iron Father Feirros represents its conscience. Master of the Forge, clan elder of Rokan, and one of the chapter's most respected Iron Fathers, Feirros is unusual amongst the sons of Ferrus Manus for one remarkable reason. He refuses to surrender his emotions. Though one of the most mechanically altered members of the Iron Hands, Feirros outright refuses any cybernetic implant or augmentation that might hinder his ability to feel emotion. Despite centuries of service, Feirros still believes that intuition, compassion, and remarkably even humor possess a value no machine can ever replicate. His dry, gallous wit is often met with blank incomprehension by many of his battle brothers, while some within the Iron Council view his beliefs as dangerously unorthodox. That said, few dare question his achievements. Time and again, Feirros has demonstrated that emotion, when mastered rather than suppressed, and well balanced with logic, is a deep source of wisdom rather than weakness. His arguments have repeatedly prevented rash decision-making within the Council, and his mentorship has profoundly influenced his old pupil, Kardan Stronos himself. With the arrival of the Primaris Space Marines during the era Indomitus, Feirros welcomed their enhanced battlefield abilities as undeniable evidence that the flesh has yet more strength to give. When the Primaris transformation became available, he was among the first in his chapter to cross the Rubicon, convinced that the flesh should not be given up on and could still be improved. To the most rigid and stubborn amongst the Iron Hands, this belief borders on heresy, viewing Feirros as a corrupted cog that threatens to bring the Iron Hands to a grinding halt. Though his deeds are indeed great, and many of the chapter's wisest minds begrudgingly concede that to balance emotion with logic requires a much greater discipline than outright erasure of one's ability to feel. Feirros represents what the Iron Hands might still become, but until that change is achieved, it is Iron Captain Caanok who best represents them as they presently exist. Iron Captain of Clan Avernii, the chapter's veteran first company, Var is regarded as one of the finest battlefield commanders in the Imperium. His strategic calculations have defeated enemies that vastly outnumbered his own warriors, while centuries of relentless campaigning have transformed almost every part of his body into relic cybernetic machinery. only a single organic eye remains. Not because it cannot be replaced, but because Var deliberately keeps it as a reminder of the weakness he believes still rots within him. His Terminator armor is integrated with the relic logic engine known as the Cerebrix, which interfaces directly with Var's neural augmetics, allowing him to process battlefield data with astonishing speed. Meanwhile, a pair of servo skulls orbit constantly at his side, feeding him a continuous stream of tactical information. Yet for all his mechanical perfection, Caanok Var remains consumed by a fury he has never been able to eradicate. He considers that anger a shameful flaw, lingering from his humanity, despite every augmentation and every attempt to suppress it. Caanok Var is more than one of the chapter's greatest warriors. He is a living embodiment of the Iron Hands themselves. Outwardly, he is almost entirely machine perfected by steel. Yet inwardly, he still wages a war against something no cybernetic implant can ever remove. For the Iron Hands, history remembers few glorious last stands or celebrated acts of heroism. Across 10,000 years, they have fought in countless conflicts, yet several stand apart for the lasting impact they have had upon both the chapter and the wider Imperium. The fall of the Lords of Gardenal came during the Great Crusade, long before the Horus Heresy would scar the Legion forever. After an Ultramarines' assault on the Industrial Empire ended in dreadful losses, Ferrus Manus arrived at the head of a combined Iron Hands and Emperor's Children force to complete the conquest. Where others had sought to execute a measured campaign, Ferrus unleashed relentless, simultaneous assaults across the planet's industrial heartlands. Dividing the Legion between the world's greatest industrial zones, the Iron Hands fought what was effectively 1,000 battles at once, dismantling their enemy's military machine piece by piece until its rulers had nowhere left to turn. Even when the Lords of Gardenal finally offered unconditional surrender, Feirros refused them. Previous treachery had already rendered mercy illogical. Only after the last of the ruling aristocrats had been destroyed did he finally declare, "It is done." The remaining worlds of the Gardenal Empire surrendered without resistance, and what had begun as a humiliating imperial defeat became one of the Great Crusade's most decisive victories. During the darkest years of the Horus Heresy, after the death of their Primarch, the fleeting remnants of the Iron Hands refused to retreat into obscurity. Among their most significant victories stands the destruction of Bod, the World Eater's primary recruitment and training world. A strike force of Clan Moragal fought its way deep into the planet's subterranean vaults before systematically eradicating every trace of life upon its surface. Though modest in scale compared to the galaxy-spanning battles of the Heresy, this campaign permanently severed one of the World Eater's greatest sources of new recruits, dealing a huge strategic blow, the consequences of which would echo long after the war had ended. Perhaps no battlefield better reflects the Iron Hands' devotion to armored warfare than the Battle of Talaran, still regarded as the largest Imperial tank battle in history. After the Iron Warriors virus-bombed the once fertile world into a lifeless desert, the Iron Hands joined the Imperial Fists in a colossal mechanized campaign. With the poisoned atmosphere making infantry warfare almost impossible, the conflict became a contest fought almost entirely between battle tanks and armored vehicles. Millions of tons of steel clashed across the endless dunes as vast armored columns battled one another in a war unlike anything seen before or since. When the fighting finally ended, the Iron Warriors had been driven back, but the cost was substantial. More than 1 million shattered tanks now lay rusting beneath Talaran's endless sands, creating a graveyard of steel that remains one of the galaxy's greatest monuments to mechanized warfare. In more recent millennia, no campaign has better symbolized the Iron Hands' gradual evolution than the Gaudinia campaign, where they confronted the demonic entity known only as the Sapphire King. Born from the psychic trauma of Ferrus Manus' death on Istvan V, this demon had spent millennia feeding upon the Iron Hands' greatest flaw, the emotions they relentlessly sought to suppress. It lingered within the chapter's shadow, tempting its warriors ever further towards cold detachment, knowing that every grief denied, every rage buried, and every spark of humanity repressed only strengthened its hold over them. When Iron Father Christos assembled one of the largest Iron Hands deployments seen in centuries, leading more than 800 battle brothers and much of the Iron Council to Galdenia, the Sapphire King judged the chapter ripe for corruption and sprung its trap. As Christos and many of his followers succumbed to corruption, howling demons of Slaanesh erupted into reality alongside members of the Emperor's children, forcing the Iron Hands to confront not only the Sons of Fulgrim, but the emotional scars they had carried since the Horus Heresy. The harder the Iron Hands fought to suppress their emotions through absolute logic, the faster they fell beneath the demon's influence, transformed into grotesque flesh machine abominations that, in a twisted way, embodied everything the Iron Hands sought to become. It was then that Iron Father Kardan Stronos reached the revelation that would forever alter the chapter's future. Their salvation did not lie in suppressing emotion more completely, but in mastering it. At Stronos' command, the warriors of the chapter disengaged the emotional inhibitor protocols they had relied upon for centuries, unleashing the rage, grief, and determination they had buried since the death of their father. Furious war cries screamed across the battlefield as emotions long imprisoned were finally brought under conscious control rather than denied. Deprived of the repressed anguish it had been feasting upon, the Sapphire King shrieked in fury as its power bled away before being utterly destroyed. The surviving Iron Hands tore through the demonic host with a ferocity they had never before allowed themselves to display, reducing any remaining demon engines to molten slag beneath a devastating orbital bombardment. To those who survived, the flesh remained weak, but perhaps denying their humanity entirely had proven to be a weakness of its own. This lesson would be tested once again during the second relief of Mordian in the opening years of the era Indomitus. As Imperial forces abandoned the war-ravaged Stigurus sector, the Iron Hands refused to retreat, instead making their stand upon the besieged world. Joined by the Brazen Claws, Fire Lords, Silver Skulls, Sons of Medusa, and Iron Lords in what became known as the Iron Crusade, they launched a sudden assault against the Night Lord's warlord Deathstrike, whose reign of terror threatened to plunge the entire world into the warp. Emerging without warning, the Iron Hands engaged the traitor fleet in orbit while drop pods rained upon Mordian's capital. Clan Averni, led by Iron Captain Caanok, spearheaded the assault, slicing through waves of Chaos cultists before Var himself met Deathstrike in single combat, leaving the Night Lord's warlord wounded. Yet despite their ferocious opening strike, the battle gradually turned against the Loyalists. Fresh traitor forces converged upon the Iron Hands' landing zones, while Deathstrike's fleet overwhelmed them in orbit, outnumbering their warships 3-1. Believing the sons of Ferrus Manus finally broken, the Chaos Warlord declared victory. And this was precisely the outcome the Iron Hands had anticipated. As Deathstrike committed his forces to the killing blow, the Iron Hands' successor chapters arrived from the warp, shattering the Night Lord's fleet and throwing the traitor armada into disarray. At the same moment, Loyalist warships unleashed a phenomenal orbital bombardment upon Mordian. This had been calculated from the very beginning. Following the Iron Hands' tactical doctrine known as the Hammer and the Storm, the ground assault had deliberately lured the Chaos armies into the open, while Tech Marines quietly raised void shields and reinforced the capital's surviving bunkers. The Iron Hands and those civilians they deemed worthy of survival endured the firestorm behind layers of protection, while the Night Lords were obliterated in little more than an hour of relentless bombardment. The Iron Hands are often remembered as the chapter that rejected their humanity in pursuit of perfection. Yet theirs is such a profoundly human tragedy. They lost a father they believed could never fall, and when faced with a grief they could neither understand nor accept, they searched desperately for a weakness to blame. They found it in flesh, in emotion, in themselves. They believe the flesh is weak, but Ferrus Manus never sought to create warriors incapable of feeling. He demanded discipline, not detachment, mastery, not denial. He taught his sons to overcome weakness, never to mistake their humanity for it. Every augmetic limb, every ritual replacement, every step towards becoming more machine than man has been another attempt to fix a wound that steel was never capable of healing. However, through select individuals within their ranks, For the first time in millennia, the certainty in their approach is starting to slip, and the chapter is beginning to rediscover their father's teachings. For all their steel, logic, and relentless pursuit of perfection, for now, the Iron Hands remain engulfed by a single moment of unbearable loss. But Ferrus Manus never wanted this. The greatest tragedy of the Iron Hands was never the death of their Primarch. It was that, in trying to honor him, they slowly became everything he never wanted them to be.